Hi everybody, welcome to part 2 of Kantian ethics. So what we did in the first section is just go over some of the basic ideas behind Kantian theory. What we'll be doing in this section is reviewing the poll on the case of Jessica and Tonya, and then talking about the first formulation of Kant's categorical imperative. So the categorical imperative is the main decision-making tool that we'll use in Kantian theory to determine what the moral law contains. First, let's look at Jessica and Tonya. So what I asked you to do with that quick poll is to just choose the option that you think is most consistent with what Kant would say, the advice Kant would give to Tonya in that situation. So here we have a case where Tonya thinks her roommate looks pretty bad and she's been asked to say something. Jessica has directly asked her what she thinks. So Tonya decides to just kind of tell her she looks great and not take it any further. And my question was what Kant would say about that. So hopefully you were able to find at least a couple that seemed more consistent with what Kant might be concerned with. The correct answer was that what Tonya did was wrong because lying is against the moral law. I threw in a few there that were intended to kind of fool you or misguide you. So the one answer that people frequently choose that is incorrect is that Tonya was motivated by a nice motive, which was to make her roommate feel good, and therefore it was a good thing to do. So the reason why I have that in there is that we need to be careful when we're using Kant, that we keep in mind that motive is important, but there's only one motive that gets you any moral credit with Kant, and that is to do something just out of respect for the fact that it's the right thing to do. So a properly motivated action will always be consistent with what the moral law dictates and will be motivated by respect for that moral law. So if we start looking at what people are doing and we try to kind of guess about whether we personally think their motive is good or nice or not, now we're in the realm of feelings and opinion, and those are not things that Kant would say we ought to use to determine morality. So hopefully you saw the words moral law in there and noticed that that was also an important Kantian term and decided to go that way. The other two options, there are things that Kant would definitely reject. Kant doesn't care about consequences. So if Tanya's trying to avoid roommate drama, that's not a good moral reason. That's a practical reason for doing something. So she wouldn't get any moral credit for that. Or to achieve other ends that aren't necessarily rational and based on the moral law. So now you have an idea of what Kant would tell Tonya to do in that situation. She would probably have to tell the truth because she's been directly asked by Jessica, and or at least not lie in her response to her roommate. Now that may have negative consequences, but remember, according to Kant, we're not to be held responsible for the consequences of our actions because those are out of our control. So we know that it's a universal law. We apply it to a situation to see if what we want to do complies with the moral law. As I said, it comes in two versions or two formulations. I'm only going to really be exploring the first one here. Then you're going to take a break and have some practice applying that to some very brief couple sentence long scenarios. And then we'll come back for the third video and talk about the second version. So the first categorical imperative, the way Kant phrases it here, there is therefore only one categorical imperative. It is act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it could be a universal law. So this is obviously one of those things we need to unpack and try to kind of decipher so that it makes sense to our modern ears. And there's a term in here that we definitely need to define, and that is the term maxim. So a maxim is an implied rule that underlies all our actions. So the idea here is that every time we decide to do something, we are creating a little rule for ourselves when we make that decision. So we don't necessarily have to consciously articulate that rule. We don't have to say to ourselves, here's my rule that I'm operating under. But even so, even if it's unspoken, we are all operating under certain maxims, and we're creating maxims for ourselves all the time when we act. So if I decide to cheat on a test, let's say, by looking at what my neighbor has written, then I'm making a little rule for myself in that situation that says it's okay for me to copy off my neighbor on this test. So every time we make a choice, we're creating a maxim or a rule for ourselves that underlines that choice. And what Kant wants us to do is to analyze these maxims, to think very clearly, to articulate what rule we think we're making or what rule we are making when we act, and then to see whether those rules are things that we can apply universally to everybody. So we can translate this imperative into more normal language and say, act only on those maxims that you can will everyone else to follow at the same time. In other words, when I'm making a rule of thumb for myself, I'm acting, let's say to go back to the example of cheating on the test, I should only do that if I can will that everyone else also cheats on the test at the same time. So an even simpler translation would be that you don't get to make special rules for yourself that you can't actually do if everyone else is doing it too, or that you wouldn't want everyone else to also do. So if I'm cheating on a test, it actually becomes impossible for me to do that if everyone else is also cheating off their neighbor on the test. And the reason for that is somebody in the room has got to have actually studied for the test and have the answers. If literally every person who's taking the test is cheating off their neighbor, cheating off your neighbor actually becomes impossible because there aren't any neighbors with the answers. So this is a great example of a rule that I would make that I would only want to apply to myself. I would want to be the exception. And if I know that I'm making a rule, if I'm operating under a maxim that I would really like only to apply to me, and I want everyone else to follow a different set of rules, now I know I'm talking about a maxim that isn't universalizable, that I can't will everyone to follow. So this is going to lead us to understand what our moral duty is. Remember, Kantian ethics is duty-based ethics. And so when we apply the categorical imperative, what we're trying to determine is our duty. So what we want to ask here is, can I do this if everyone else does it too? So we saw with cheating on the test that I actually can't do it. I can't even cheat on the test if everyone else is also cheating off their neighbor, because cheating itself becomes impossible. Nobody's got the answers. There's nothing to cheat from. So if I want to know whether I should cheat on the test, I ask myself this question: can I follow this maxim, this rule, it's okay to cheat off my neighbor if everyone else does it too? If the answer is yes, then the action is permitted. In the case of cheating, I know the answer is no, because I can't even do it if everyone else is doing it too. That means it's prohibited, and they have what we call a perfect duty, never ever ever to do that action. So a perfect duty means an absolute duty. You can't make any exceptions. You can't make any choices about when and where you cheat or don't cheat. It's just never allowed. So this applies to anything that we couldn't even do if everyone else was doing it too. It requires us, just as a matter of practicality, to be the only one following that maxim. So there are some examples of things that we can't even do if everyone else is doing them. Cheating is a great example. Kant says that lying and other forms of deception also fall into this category. He gives the example in the text of a person making a false promise in order to get a loan, in order to illustrate that idea. So I'm going to hold off on explaining how it is that lying doesn't work if everyone's doing it until we get to that example. But he does say here that certain things we can't do if it requires us, our success at doing them requires us to be the only one doing them. The reason for this is that the moral law, remember, is universal. That means it applies to everyone at all times. So anytime you're making a rule for yourself that only applies to you, that's a huge red flag that you're not following the moral law. So sometimes there are things that we could do if everyone else was doing them, but we wouldn't want to live in a world where everybody acted that way. So these are things that we're going to put in the category of imperfect duties. Would you want a world in which everyone acted according to this rule? If the answer is yes, I would be okay with living in a world where everybody did this thing, then the action is permitted. But if we're talking about something that you wouldn't want everyone to do, even though it's logically possible for everyone to do it at the same time, then the action is prohibited. So in this case, an imperfect duty, you get to make a choice when and where you fulfill your duty. So we're going to look at some examples of that as well. So if this isn't making complete sense yet, just keep with me, bear with me, and we're going to walk through some examples of perfect and imperfect duties that Kant provides in the text and see how these concepts apply. So some examples that he gives, giving to charity, helping others. Another example that Kant gives is cultivating your natural talents. These are all things that we want people to do, right? We would rather live in a world where people helped each other than live in a world where nobody helped each other. But in these contexts, you don't have to be charitable every single opportunity that arises. You can choose when and where and how you do that. Okay, so Kant's going to give us some examples in the text on pages 104 and 105, examples of both perfect duties. There are two examples there, and then he also gives us two examples of things that he thinks are imperfect duties. So the first example is suicide. He wants us to consider whether there's ever a case in which it would be morally permissible for a person to commit suicide. So on page 104, he starts talking about this, and there's a little Roman numeral number, or regular number 1 there, so you can very easily follow along. He says, a man feels sick of life as the result of a mounting series of misfortunes that has reduced him to hopelessness. In other words, things are going really bad for this guy. But he still possesses enough of his reason to ask himself whether it would not be contrary to his duty to himself to take his own life. So this guy, he's considering killing himself, but he's still in possession of his reason, so he's able to stop and think about it. So he tests whether the maxim of his action could be a universal law of nature. In other words, if I were to kill myself, I would be making a little rule, right? A rule underlying my behavior. That's my maxim. And I have to see whether this is a maxim that I could will everyone else to follow too. His maxim would be this. I make it my principle out of self-love to shorten my life if its continuance threatens more evil than it promises advantage. In other words, his rule of thumb would be, I can end my life when it seems like it's going to be worse to live it than not to live it. So we have to ask ourselves whether this maxim is universalizable. And he says, no, it contradicts itself when it becomes universalized, because if you're trying to make your life better, it doesn't make any sense to do that by ending your life. So he says now we have a perfect duty never to commit suicide. And because it's a perfect duty, that means that we can never make any exceptions. It applies to all people in all situations at all times. The other example that he gives is the example of the false promise. And this is going to tell us why Kant thinks all forms of dishonesty and lying are wrong. So in this example, number 2 on page 105, he says, another man finds himself driven by need to borrow money. He knows very well that he will not be able to pay it back, but he sees too that nobody will lend him anything unless he firmly promises to pay it back within a fixed time. In other words, there's this guy, he needs money, he knows he'll never be able to repay this loan. But he also knows that he won't get the loan unless he promises to repay it. So the question is it okay for him to make this false promise, to promise to repay a loan he knows full well he'll never be able to repay in order to get the money that he needs? He wants to make such a promise, but he still has enough conscience to ask himself, isn't it impermissible and contrary to duty to get out of one's difficulties this way? Okay, so if he did it, what would his maxim be? What would his rule be? Kant says his maxim would be, when I believe myself short of money, I will borrow money and promise to pay it back, even though I know this will never be done. Okay, so we have to ask whether this maxim is universalizable. In other words, if I am going to lie in order to get a loan that I need, can I do that if everyone else always lies in order to get loans that they need? He says no. The maxim contradicts itself when universalized. The reason for that is in order for me to be believed when I say I'll repay a loan, I need the lender to think I'm telling the truth, right? And if everyone always lies when they try to get a loan, the lender's not going to think I'm telling the truth because this would be a universal practice to always lie. So what I need in order to be successful in my false promise is for everyone else to be truthful. Otherwise, my promise wouldn't be believed. The default assumption would be, of course, you're lying. So this is one example of a logically contradictory maxim. I can't even do it if everyone else is doing it, because if everyone lies, then nobody gets believed and nobody gets a loan. So this is a perfect duty then, never to make a false promise, not to lie about what you're willing to do or what you can do. So Kant is very much opposed to any form of dishonesty and lying because it can't be universalized, because in order for me to be believed as a liar, I need most people to be telling the truth. So this is a great example of me making a special rule for myself that I don't want other people to follow. He also gives us some examples of imperfect duty starting on 105. So those two examples are a person who wants to neglect his talents. And the example there is there's someone who has a lot of inherent talents, but it would take a lot of work for him to develop them, and he's kind of lazy. So he doesn't really feel like doing that. So this is a case where we can imagine a world in which everyone was lazy and nobody cultivates their talents, right? This isn't something that's logically contradictory. I can be lazy and neglect my talents, and there's nothing stopping me from doing that if everyone else does it too. But he says we wouldn't want everyone to act this way. We would prefer to have a world where people did cultivate their talents. That would be a better world for us to live in. So if that's the case, then we have an imperfect duty to spend some of our time cultivating some of our talents. Because it's an imperfect duty, it means that we don't have to cultivate every single talent that we think we might have to the fullest extent possible. We get to choose which talents we want to cultivate, and we get to choose the extent to which we want to do that. But we have a duty to cultivate some of our talents some of the time. We probably shouldn't completely neglect them and just be lazy because we don't feel like it. The other example is giving to charity, or generally being charitable and helping other people out. So in this example, it says a fourth man who is himself flourishing but sees others who have to struggle with great hardships asks himself whether it matters to him and whether he ought to help these others. So if he didn't help other people, that is possible to do, even if no one else helped other people either, right? So in that case, the maxim of don't help others doesn't contradict itself. It's fine in terms of logic. But we wouldn't want a world in which everyone acted this way, in which no one ever helped another person out. So for that reason, we have an imperfect duty to sometimes help other people. Again, because it's an imperfect duty, we don't have to help every single person that we encounter who needs help all the time. But we should help some people some of the time, because otherwise we would have this world that we don't want, that we just decided we don't want, which is a world where nobody helps each other out. So we have two examples of perfect duties. Those are never to commit suicide and never to make a false promise. You're never allowed to do those at any time because they would require you to be the only one to really do them. And then we have two examples of imperfect duties, neglecting your talents and being charitable. These are things that you need to do some of the time. So there's a worksheet that I have uploaded onto Moodle, and it's just basically a short practice worksheet. I have a few different scenarios there, and what I want you to do is for each one, identify the maxim. If this person did whatever it is they're thinking about doing in the scenario, what would their maxim be? What would the rule that they would be making for themselves be in that situation? And then ask yourself, is it universalizable? Can this person even do this thing if everyone else was doing it too? And then, is it a rule that you would want everyone to follow? So if your answer to this second question, is it universalizable? If your answer to that is no, you can't even do it if other people do it too, you're done, right? You already know that this is a prohibited act and you don't have to move on to this third point. If it is something that's logically possible to do if everyone else is doing it too, then your next question is this something that we would want to be made a universal rule? So after you do that, come back to me. We'll go through our third PowerPoint. So when you're analyzing a case using Kantian theory, this is a crucial step. Being able to say, if this person did this thing, here's what their rule would be that they would be making for themselves. And here's why it either does or does not conform with moral law.